Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure for the panel members and myself to be with you this afternoon to discuss the evolving project delivery models for public infrastructure sector. As you know, that sector is pretty dynamic right now. There is a lot of scrutiny and inquiries on the traditional P3 model. Uh, a number of major players of the industry are scaling back from participating in the full DBFOM or DBFM models. Public authorities have recently introduced alternative delivery models, such as Progressive DB or Alliance, and are considering and reassessing current P3 template agreements with respect to, for example, risk allocations, dispute resolution mechanism, etc. Today's panel is going to discuss the underlying reasons for this evolution. It will highlight some of the key features as well as the pros and cons of the new models. It will compare and contrast them with the P3 models, as well as other traditional delivery models. It will provide examples on the current use of these models and forecast what the near future looks like for them, as well as for the traditional models. Our panel members are all known in the industry, and their positions, titles speaks for themselves. They don't need extensive introductions. We have Michael Liedemann, President and CEO of Infrastructure BC. We have Michael Lindsay, President and CEO of Infrastructure Ontario. We have Nick Hann, Consultant and Advisor to Alberta Infrastructure. And we have the last but not the least, Doug Sanders, Partner at BLG. A quick note before we start, we encourage you to ask questions by using the Ask a Question tab at the right bottom of your screen. Before getting into a discussion on the features of the new models that we've seen recently in the market, it will be very helpful to understand the underlying reason for considering and adopting new models, or possibly making changes or substantial changes to current DBFOM models. So let's start with Mark in the West and then shift to Michael, Nick, and Doug thereafter to discuss those questions. Over to you, Mark.
All right. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Thanks very much, Pascale. Thanks also for C2P3 for organizing this forum. Look forward to it today with my colleagues, myself. In terms of, I think first and foremost, we really see challenges in market capacity overall. And, to some degree, I'd say in British Columbia, we're not necessarily helping matters much in that we are putting out probably record levels of infrastructure projects into the market, as are other owners, public and private. So we really have, I guess, an overheated market. We see, very rapid issues associated with escalation. Market capacity means that we have fewer bidders available on our projects to bid. And as you kind of referenced in your earlier comments, Pascale, we have some bidders, SNC among others, that have kind of pulled out of the globally fixed price, fixed schedule bidding market. So we see some of that capacity is just retrenched or focused on different delivery models, making it hard. And I guess, in BC, our favored models at the moment are probably design, build, finance, and design, build in the absence of any of these constraints. But that's not a market that all players are, I guess, focused on competing on. I say partly due to the competitive nature of other projects that have different risk profiles and different options. And then, I guess to eventually compound that, there's a lot of kind of new government policy directions, which I support and need to support and look forward to supporting. But that kind of adds new complexity and challenge to some of the procurements that we're doing in BC. And if people are looking to say, is this going to make this job more difficult to bid or more complicated to bid? Maybe there's other options for them to bid that are less complicated or less expensive to pursue. And then, some of the things actually are also somewhat pandemic related. Interestingly, I had a bidder that I've been talking to over a series of months that is capable of bidding on our kind of larger projects, but they've informed me that they will no longer pursue projects with any form of financing due to a corporate directive, which I think actually stems from a pandemic-related issue to preserve cash on their balance sheet, and they don't want liability issues associated with the financing which they sign up to. So, that removes one bidder from kind of our DBF pool, again, forcing us to potentially look at different types of models to have those people come back. The US is also, a contributing factor. They're roaring ahead in the US. I've seen some people that are more US based saying they're going to somewhat pull back from the BC market, at least, to focus on opportunities in the US to support often a lot of really large tech clients and projects. Again, just leaving fewer resources in Canada. And then we kind of have the whole demographic issue, which is really a national issue. And we have a lot of people aging out of the infrastructure skills market, again, exacerbating kind of supply issues. And that doesn't even start to get into the actual material supply issues, which are still affected by COVID, causing problems for pricing for contractors. And then maybe the last point I would make is our projects are growing in size and complexity, which further reduces the number of bidders that can pursue them on a kind of design build fixed price kind of basis, whether that's with or without financing. So I think there's a lot of reasons why we need to start considering different models, and we'll talk about this later in the panel, but I think that's some of the reasons why these different models are in consideration in BC, but other jurisdictions might have similar, but also some unique factors. So maybe I'll let someone else on the panel contribute as we go from west to east. Maybe get that's Michael then.
Michael, do you have the same or different experience than Mark?
Thanks, Mark. I can't tell if I'm having the connectivity issues or you are. And if it's me, sincere apologies to everybody who hopefully can hear the sound of my voice. Hope you're all
Definitely
healthy. Hope you're all hopeful. My thanks as well to the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships and BLG for putting on this event today. Really appreciate the opportunity to continue to talk about our market to our market. And I guess I'd start by paraphrasing Mark Twain or Paul McCartney, as you prefer. I think rumors of the death of the P3 have been greatly exaggerated. To build on Mark's commentary, I think here in Ontario, the reason that we are inquisitive about project delivery models in the present moment is because we have a differentiated set of objectives, project to project. Everything that Mark has said about market capacity and some of the constraints and the trends and forces that we're facing, as well as the corporate decisions that have been made by some of the counterparties in our market, are bang on. But I think we always like to begin this conversation with reference to what is it that we're actually solving for in a given project. We very much still embrace the principle of risk being allocated to the party that is best positioned to manage it. But we know increasingly that there's a bundle of risks on some of our projects, particularly complex linear projects, where we've been educated collectively as a market about what it takes to effectively manage permitting, licenses and approvals risks, and the extent to which that is more of a shared exercise that needs to have dedicated contingencies ultimately put against it. I think that there are times when we're solving for a fixed price and a fixed schedule. I think that there are times when we're delivering in a brownfield corridor and we need operational flexibility for an active transit system that leads us to take into account a possible different basis of contract form or approach. I think that there are missions that certainly we're being given in the present moment, and I know it's probably true coast to coast to coast, where what we're solving for is rapidity of delivery and an inability to spend the same kind of time that we otherwise would upfront on design and development and site condition assessment. And that puts us into a different space in respect of how we want to partner with the market. And frankly, across all of it, I think we're in the vein of wanting to make sure that there's an appropriate amount of design and project development that happens on all of our projects, regardless of the resultant contract form that carries us through construction and the life of a concession, to make sure that we're getting maximum technical innovation that either expresses itself in respect of cost savings or enhanced user value or any number of other outcomes. So, increasingly where I think we're trying to take this discussion with policymakers in the province of Ontario is the right tool for the right job. And that quite intentionally, we want to work with our market to figure out on the intrinsic characteristics of any given project, where it makes the most sense for us to locate our contractual agreement and the rights and responsibilities associated therewith, given what we're trying to do. So for us, I don't think it's about, the journey that any other jurisdiction's been on. This is not about, a global tidal force that's swept through the UK and then Australia, and slowly but surely it's coming to North America. I think it's very much about standing back and looking at our $66 billion pipeline in the province of Ontario, factoring in all that Mark said about market capacity issues and competitive dynamic and the availability of skilled labor and the advisors who help us, whether PDCs or TAs. How do we curate the best sort of pipeline that bears on the objectives of the public sector to the greatest extent possible? So I'm looking forward to the discussion today. I think that's really where we come at it from.
Thank you, Michael. Nick, you've been on both or all sides of projects throughout North America and globally. Do you have some additional thoughts or observations on the subject?
Yes, thank you. And hopefully you can hear me. And again, thank you for organizing this panel. I feel a bit like a sort of poacher turned gamekeeper. Obviously, for most of my 30-year career, I was on the private sector side, developing these projects and financing them. In recent years, first at Canada Infrastructure Bank and now assisting Invest Alberta in the Alberta marketplace. I'm kind of helping out the government. So, I've seen this market evolve, for want of a better word, since, nobody called it PPPs, everybody called it build, own, transfer. And I think what we need to do is remember that, markets do come in phases. We need to make sure that we, remember the reasons why we were using certain models and certain techniques in the first place. And I think we've got to be very careful we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. To put it another way, Michael Lindsay said, pick the right tool for the right job. I would say, as a very bad handyman personally, I would say we've got to make sure that we're using the tools that we've got in the right way, and that if we cut our fingers on them, it may be because the tool's faulty, but it may be because we're not using it right as well. So the way I see it, and again, Michael, I think said it well, that, we shouldn't be swept up in part of a global trend, that the reality is that, for good and for bad, we have a very particular and specialized model or version of the PPP model here in Canada. It's been good for us in some ways. It's been, problematic in other ways. And many of the trends that are happening in the rest of the world are not driven by exactly the same factors that we have in the Canadian model. Just very briefly, I think we have a model in Canada that's very commoditized, wasn't particularly flexible for the more challenging projects that Mark Liedemann and Michael Lindsay have talked about. Became a bit of a one-way bet for the private sector. There was a lot of downside, but not necessarily a lot of upside, and really drove out private finance. And that's the last thing I wanted to focus on, before we get into more of the detail. I think that if you look at both Canada and the world, the models are evolving in two directions. The focus of today is, models that maybe take back or share more of the design build risk. But I think the alternative model, which certainly Canada Infrastructure Bank is pursuing, is a model where the private sector as a whole takes on more risk, and there's more private sector financing, particularly more private sector equity. And that in turn can mean that the contractors are actually taking, less of the risk. I think we have a knee-jerk reaction in Canada because of our model that if the financiers are taking risk, then they pass 100% down to the contractors. That's just simply not the case, in many sectors around the rest of the world. So I think we have those two very divergent models, and I, as people might anticipate from my background, I favor the model where we get the private sector more involved, taking more appropriate risks and taking more of the financing burden.
I think we lost you, Nick, right at the end. Doug, you have also been involved on all sides of those type of projects. Any element you would like to add? Or
Wow. I have no idea what's going on.
oh, it's okay now.
Okay. It's still echoing.
Maybe while Doug is fixing his technical issues, maybe we can pass on to the next subject. Next subject is the current status of standard DBFOM, DBFM models and templates used by the authorities. Starting with Michael, what are the current plans of IO to reassess and change the key terms of the IO templates for those models? Michael? Michael, can you hear me? No. Doug, can you hear me or no? Okay. Mark, you can?
Okay. I have no idea. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Let me give this a try. Who was
in the meantime, Michael, can you hear me? Nope. Then, Mark, can you hear me? Good. Then we'll start with you on the assessment or. Oh. Mark, over to you. Can you discuss the intent of BC Infrastructure to reassess and review the key terms of their templates agreements?
So on our side, we are a little more focused on the DBF model. We are not currently procuring any DBF or DBFOMs. I don't think I have a plan in the intermediate time to pursue more of those. We do like the DBF for the kind of lender oversight and kind of the better certainty that we feel that it brings to completion, particularly for projects kind of with multiple phases. But I think regardless of whether they're talking about a DB or a DBF or even DBFOM, I think we are looking to make some changes, probably more on the civil side. I think the risks on kind of vertical infrastructure, we talk about hospitals, courts, and those types of things. The risk profile generally is, I think, easier to manage for the contractors. Generally we're most often talking about greenfield sites. Once they get out of the ground, a lot of that control and risk, the contractors are well placed to manage. So I don't think we're really looking for a lot of changes on that. And I don't think we've had a lot of problems with disputes or claims associated with our vertical infrastructure projects. Nothing out of the ordinary. But I think the civil side is a different kettle of fish altogether. They have very different risk profiles to start with. They tend to be much longer and more linear. And we see kind of a lot more challenges in the permitting side. Some of these are in connection with First Nations related consultation and others, particularly if there's kind of water and other more environmental issues. And historically, I think we've tried to transfer more of that risk or maybe have an unequal sharing of that risk. But I think that's proving to be very complicated and probably controversial. So I think we need to have a revisit of how we deal with permitting risks. And it does need to move to more of a sharing model. And I think one of the reasons for that is not only is the private sector not only potentially best placed to manage that risk, but if we think about the early aspects of Indigenous engagement and kind of environmental approval processes, those are actually all managed by the public sector. And then at some point during the procurement, we try to transfer them through. But the relationships actually are inherent in the public sector, whoever that owner is, that has been having discussions with the Indigenous groups and with the environmental approval type bodies. And I think it makes sense for them to have an ongoing role, which needs to be defined and managed with the contractor to help those types of things carry on. The same could apply to utilities to some degree as well. And because utilities are a big bone of contention all the time and a big pot of risks. And I think wherever possible, we need to kind of look on our side to not so much change the risk allocation, but break these projects up into more early work type projects and identify which major utility items that we can do on the public side in advance of procurement to effectively de-risk it. So the risk actually doesn't need to be transferred. I can see Nick Hann shaking his head on his side. He'll get his chance in a minute, but some of these risks are very hard for the contractors to manage. And these not always, utilities are difficult to kind of have leverage over. So we're looking to do some of these things in advance with some of the more complicated utilities to de-risk and allow the contractors to do what they need to do to design and build the infrastructure. They're not effective against managing a bunch of these utilities. We don't have contractual power over a lot of them, and neither do they. So we're looking to, I guess, make some changes, but not really on the vertical side. I think our changes are focused more on the civil side. Maybe I'll go there and let Michael carry on from there.
Thanks, Mark. And Pascale, my apologies for being non-responsive to you before.
Oh, that's okay.
My friends, my colleagues. Just picking up where Mark has left off, three things that we have done systematically, I would say, to try to evolve, let me put it that way, the underlying basis of the DBF and DBFM models that we're using, regardless of whether they're on the social or the civil side. It's worth recalling the last three projects we brought to financial close here in Ontario all could be thought of as civil linear projects, QEW, Credit River Bridge, and the two advanced tunnels contracts for Eglinton and Scarborough. All three of them were DBFs, right? At the end of the day, I think the first thing is, Nick's face vis-a-vis de-risking aside, I think that there are things that government can do with its own authorities in respect of permits, licenses, and approvals. And I would salute the work of the Government of Ontario with the Building Transit Faster Act to actually genuinely de-risk these projects by ultimately providing the kinds of backstops that might, in cases of really chronic bad performance, fundamentally change, right, the regulatory profile of one of these projects. I think that is very different than just parties coming together and trying to figure out how best to share and mitigate risks, but that's important. Second, for us, there are some risks where we are just changing our comfort in respect of being exposed to those risks as a contracting authority. any of the people who can hear the sound of my voice who participated to the advanced tunnels contracts know that we took a very different approach in respective regime to geotechnical risk on those two projects, provided a far greater reliance on the baseline information that ultimately we were giving to counterparties in connection to those projects. There's a concomitant reality for us as the contracting authority that we have to get decision makers comfortable with the notion of that risk being retained at some level of exposure by the contracting authority and to plan for contingencies associated with that. But I think the lived experience of our delivery on transit projects in particular, not just ours, but everybody's over the last 15 years, has educated us all in respect of those risks and how easy they are to fully predict at the moment that you get going on one of these projects. And then third, not for nothing, I mean, our Schedule 7 protocol is something that we've taken a significant forward is on Bay. It tries to recognize that disputes correctional fees mutually agreed to sit in adjudication of those disputes. Second, that perhaps to a much greater degree than there's ever been in the province of Ontario, some mid-project resolution of those types of disputes, and where those mid-project resolutions run against the contracting authority, some cash flow for our counterparties in respect of them. I mean, I think even that, it doesn't necessarily bear on a specific risk, but it does bear upon what we've atmospherically been talking about as a collective, which is how adversarial the underlying dynamic ultimately is. So again, whether it's civil or social in our DBF, DBFM construct, these are the things that we're working on and continue to talk to industry about continuously to make sure that we hopefully are in the right crosshairs in respect of each one of those things.
Pascale,
Thank you, Michael.
Are you able to hear me without a bunch of echo?
Yes.
Or is it still problematic?
It's still a bit problematic, Doug. Maybe you can try to...
How about that? Is that any better?
A lot of echo, Doug.
Maybe if I could just comment while Doug's sorting out the technology. Again, going back to a comment I made at the beginning, overwhelmingly in my experience, and I know a lot of other practitioners in the marketplace would say the same, we've actually got a suite of tools under the existing model that we're using, which have been kind of time tested, but we're not actually using them. And I think public authorities, are perhaps slightly more at fault because, sometimes there's an education issue. The people actually managing the contract are not necessarily the people who put the deal together in the first place. But the truth is, in my experience, nobody's really using the contracts as they're intended to be used when there are problems. And that starts in the procurement phase, and it goes on, through bidding and into implementation. So to give you an example in procurement, I think there was an element of complacency. The number of times that I was, leading or involved in bidding groups, and we had a fundamental problem with, one of the relief events, and we wanted to negotiate it and have a more detailed structure to allocate risk, because we weren't, we knew what the areas of potential problem are in advance. Most of these things, pandemics aside, are not surprises. Where there are going to be stress points. And I've been involved in a lot of teams where we tried to negotiate a more detailed set of relief arrangements, and the public authority in procurement basically said to us, no, this clause was accepted by the market, on the last deal, which may frankly have been a completely different type of deal with a completely different risk profile. So, just price it and accept it. And the number of times that, in some teams, we kind of just sucked it up and said, okay, If this risk eventuates, we'll rely on the very broad relief event terms that we have, knowing that there were going to be problems later on. And in some cases, in quite a few cases, the team I was with, unfortunately, basically said, well, we're either not going to bid or we're just going to submit a stink bid because we feel that we cannot price this. So, my overwhelming view is we have a lot of tools. We have a good suite of tools in our existing model, but we're not actually using it effectively. The second key point I would make, and it goes back to financing, I won't name names of projects, but there's one, relatively complex transit project structured under a traditional DBFOM type model where the private equity in the deal represents 2% of enterprise value. We're deluding ourselves if we think that 2% equity is actually taking any real risk. I like to say that, Doug's lawyer's fees alone will probably exceed the amount of money of equity if anything goes remotely badly wrong. So we've got a model, but we've squeezed the juice out of the model, and then we're surprised when the model doesn't work when it's stressed. What we've got to do is go back and rethink, how we're using the model before we just throw out the model and try something different. There are a lot of good ideas in the alternative models that we're about to discuss, but almost all of them are capable of being incorporated in the model that we have today, which has actually done us a pretty good job in terms of protecting the taxpayer interest for the last 15 years. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And maybe the last quick comment is, as you probably know, I'm a Brit and an Australian, but I've become a Canadian and I'm a convert. If our goal is to have conflict-free contracting, that feels a lot to me like hockey without hitting. It's never going to happen. We need to put some rules around the hitting and the fights so that people don't kill each other in these deals. But to try and avoid conflict completely is an unrealistic expectation.
Over to you, Doug.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, pretty good.
My fourth or fifth different sound device. So I tend to agree with most of the comments that have been made. I think one of the things we haven't talked about are the failures. And to Nick's point, there have been some stresses around the project delivery methods. We have had a couple of contractors go bankrupt. We've had some companies that have lost money, which in a way is a failure, and lost a lot of money. We've had companies like Bilfinger Berger, who were an early market participant and lost, not necessarily on their Canadian projects, but worldwide, to the point where they moved out of the construction industry. So those failures are stress testing the model. Some of the large disputes are stress testing the model. COVID has stress tested the model. And I tend to agree with Nick that there are going to be places for alternative models, but we have to be very cautious in moving to those because they are, as we'll talk about in a minute, dramatically different. I also think that, to a point Mark made, we are seeing some accelerated projects where government wants them in the marketplace early, probably before they're ready. And when you look at a lot of the disputes that occur on these projects, yes, it's about utilities, yes, it's about permitting, but it's also about scope. It's if the owner walks into a hospital project not really understanding what they want, not really understanding the model, they're going to get a lot of disputes and they're going to get a lot of stress points in that project. And that's another danger that we'll talk about in a minute with some of the new models, is it's hard enough to deal with what are reasonably conventional models, design build with finance added. If you don't understand how these new models work, and there are significant differences and people don't take a different attitude, we've already seen in their limited use in Canada some remarkable problems with them that will get exacerbated as you grow project size. And so you have to be very cautious with how you use and develop those. To me, if you boil down what are the really big issues, model is one thing, but how you use it and how you apply it is important. An owner that's done their homework knows what they want. An owner that's appropriately resourced, because as much as we're seeing constrained technical workforces on the contractor side, we're also seeing it on the owner side. And I'm not talking necessarily about the agencies, but the actual project delivery folks on the ground. And so not having appropriately resourced owners teams, and then, frankly, getting designers and contractors who've bid appropriately, because it sounds really great to have a juicy low number, but if that low number isn't sufficient to do the project, you're going to get claims. It's just a way of the world. So those are kind of my introductory remarks.
Thank you, Doug. It is a good segue to discussing the emerging new models. Michael, can you provide some highlights on the alliance model that you've used on the Union Station project, and specifically the specific drivers that make you select that type of delivery models over to the traditional P3 one?
Yes, of course, Pascale. And back to my opening commentary that I think was rendered without video and hopefully was heard. I mean, it is all about objectives at the end of the day and the intrinsic risk profile of a project. So Union Station, incredibly complex operating environment, dense overlapping layers of ownership at that particular site, a scope of work ultimately that does, to Doug's point, still had a little bit of flexibility associated with it, given that ultimately what we were trying to do was establish a platform that would be highly usable to the purposes of the eventual encore procurement, which is coming at us and is the bigger procurement, right, that ultimately does establish the bi-directional every 15-minute sort of go service in the province. So a project like that one, where the risks are not only not fully known, but even where known, difficult for any party to quantify, ultimately at the end of the day, leads itself to, I think, an alliance model. And our selection to use it there was intentional, Phil and I, on the basis of the characteristics of that project. Now, here is where I would just affirm, I think, lots of what Doug effectively was just unpacking for us, right? I think we know the different forms of the alliance model that have been used in different jurisdictions. We get the cost plus nature of it. We understand what it means to say no fault, no claims. I think one of the questions that, is on my mind continuously about the deployment of this model, or indeed any model, is owner's team, contracting authority capability to step into it fully, right? To understand the imperatives that it places upon us as we participate to an alliance configuration, an alliance leadership team, the kinds of discretionary choices that otherwise would accrue to the contracting authority about the conduct of a project, and the need effectively to compromise on that in order to fully step into what an alliance construct looks like. And I think, to the credit of the Metrolinx and IO teams and the Ministry of Transportation, we've tried to live the truth, right, of what it means to participate in an alliance. But it is the thing that, as a leader of an organization like IO, I spend a lot of my time thinking about. How do we have the right set of capabilities, the right advisors who serve us in connection to these sorts of models? And how do we have, more than anything, the right delegation of authority in the construct to enable it to work? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's one of the most important things. So I'd say, so far so good. Kudos to our partners as much as anybody else. There is one very specific dimension of this, which I'm deeply inquisitive about. I mean, collaborative behavioral assessments are a big part, obviously, of selecting a counterparty through a procurement associated with this model. We did that, on a remote basis in the early days of the pandemic. I certainly think that was an additional challenge. But again, just to make sure that both sides, Project Co and ourselves, or private sector partners and ourselves, need to be satisfied that those kinds of behavioral assessments, which underpin so much of the selection of a counterparty and the configuration of a team on alliance, that we're getting genuine reads, right, of how collaborative both parties are going to be. So ultimately, these are some of the things that are on our mind as we think about alliance and where to use it in Ontario.
Thank you. Mark, can you provide us some highlights on the progressive DB model that is being used in BC?
Yeah, we're effectively using it on 5 healthcare projects. We actually kind of got started on this by, I'd say, by accident. It wasn't planned. We started on a $1.3 billion hospital, which was going to be a DBF, I think, at one time. We tried many different models, actually, DB and DBF. But both of those resulted in a single bidder responding. And this was actually several years ago. So this was early warning sign for us about coming capacity constraint issues and acute care hospitals in particular in BC. So, it was kind of a part of a 3-phase redevelopment of the hospital site. And we didn't really have time to say, well, we'll just park this for a couple of years and come back. So we needed to proceed. So the direction was go ahead and Ellis Don was the proponent that stepped forward. So the direction was, okay, go ahead and kind of keep as much of your procurement process as you can, notwithstanding you only have one bidder, and try to go through an RFP process with them and work towards an ultimate transaction. Clearly, you're not going to have competitive tension the way you would with multiple bidders. But, we had, I'd say, a very willing partner in Ellis Don. There were definitely challenges along the way. And we kind of used a lot of those things that we tried out and learned and experimented with during that process. And then we started to do a couple of more intentional progressive design builds where we said, okay, so the market likes it because it eliminates a lot of their pursuit costs because we go down to one proponent very early. So it's market friendly in a capacity perspective, and it preserves capacity within the industry. So those parts are positive. And then, but what it takes is it does take owner knowledge and experience. I would say that it's a bit of a different profile. We think about a competitive DB scenario. Once you have your statement of requirements done and you have multiple teams bidding, we always have some defined evaluation process. You get through that process and there's a winner and you sign up to that party. And hopefully it's affordable within whatever budget allocation you originally got. But under these arrangements, it's really a protracted negotiation. So the owner needs a different set of skills, I would argue. And it's similar to not similar in that Alliance also requires the right owner's team. This also requires the right owner's team to be successful. So it is a protracted negotiation. And the objective is that you probably need to take more of the design development before you get an actual price at the end of the day, so that you can reduce some of the contingencies and get better input from the owner to reduce those contingencies about your project. But at the same time, the tricky parts for the owner is determining, do you get good value at the end of the day? You can't compare to the next price because you only have one. So that's much harder on the owner side. And I think on the owner side, then we also have these kind of very large and potentially difficult to use off-ramps that we can kind of reach in and take over the design subcontract and tell the design builder, sorry, this is not working for us. You've either lost interest in this project or we think your pricing is completely ridiculous. And then we can go in another direction using the design that we've paid for on a monthly basis as we go along. Those are difficult decisions for the public sector to enact. But they do provide, I guess, important ultimate escape hatches if we really think there is a problem. So it's not without its challenges, but and I think personally, I would probably be more comfortable using this kind of early contractor involvement, probably on projects that are, I'd say, small to medium size. I don't think I would recommend this for like the $1 billion hospitals. We're using it often on like $200, $300, $400 million hospitals. That seems more appropriate. I'm less likely to recommend it for a $1 or $2 billion hospital unless there was something very unique about it. To date, we've only used it in the hospital sector, but we're not opposed to using this on other ones as well.
Good. Doug, you've been involved with the integrated project delivery model as well as the other new models. How does the IPD differ from the Alliance and the progressive design build models?
So IPD was first used in the US in a number of large hospital projects, and because of the rich claims history, if I can put it that way, in the US, they were trying to find a different way of going about it, and so tried to create a collective approach to the delivery of those hospitals. There's not a lot of data about how successful or not they are. If I tell you that your $5,000 or $5,000 outhouse is actually $1 billion project, but I've managed to get it in at 100 million, that doesn't really solve anything. You aren't really gaining any data. So understanding and knowing whether or not you're actually gaining out of an IPD relationship is one that's a bit challenging. I mean, progressive DB, as Mark has already described quite well, we've been doing for years in varying forms. So it's not terribly new, and you get a lot of the competition aspects out of the sub-trade pricing, those that aren't involved in the early contractor involvement. So there's still a fair bit of our current models. It's a tweak as opposed to a whole rewrite, whereas alliancing and IPD are quite different. Certainly some of the public authorities have difficulties with the cost plus nature that Michael was talking about earlier. Cost plus tends to retain a lot of risk for the authority party, and a lot of public entities theoretically at least want fixed prices, even though fixed doesn't necessarily mean fixed. It means starting point, not end point. But the whole no blame, no upper end profit at risk, which is what IPD has, is a bit of a challenge for some authorities. And Michael's quite right. You have to have a very a knowledgeable owners team that knows what they're doing, and an owner that's prepared to accept and understand how that works. And part of the challenge we've seen in some of the IPD projects isn't necessarily at the owner, call it general, or owner consultant relationship. It's the sub-trades. And the sub-trades go, yeah, that's great. We'll be collaborative, and that's really wonderful. And then they walk in, and everybody's using the same old standards, subcontracts, and they walk in and use their same old standard attitude, which is maybe good or bad, but it's not an alliancing attitude. So that whole education piece is really important to the extent that you're wanting to try some of these new models in the particular circumstances that demand them.
Good. Nick, do you think that there's any risk that there will be too many models in use in Canada?
Yes. So, in summary, I have, there are quite a lot of good ideas in these alternative models. My view is that they can all be accommodated within the model we already have, if we use it properly and flexibly. The real challenge that I have with the discussion of the alternative models really falls into three categories. The first is, I am an unashamed believer that the only way ultimately that you get effective risk transfer is through financing. And I'm using financing in the broadest sense. Basically, whenever you have, any form of contractual dispute or contractual disagreement or, agreement to agree, fundamentally the party who is owed the money is in a stronger position than the party who owes the money. And sorry, the other way around. I'm sorry about that. And it really comes down to that. And my big concern is that based on my understanding of these models, they drive out private financing. It's not impossible to squeeze private finance into them, but the reality is that for all of the reasons that we've been squeezing private finance out of our existing model, where we can't understand the risk transfer benefits for the cost, I think that's even more likely under these new models. So I would go as far as to say that these new models are not going to be financed in the private markets at any, on any sensible basis. My third issue is I think the one Mark Liedemann touched on, which is, these are challenging models on the public sector side. And when I look at all the reasons we've taken the traditional P3 model in the wrong direction are going to be amplified in this in these new models. In other words, they're going to be very difficult models for the private sector to implement. For the public sector to implement, because the public sector fundamentally wants to get to apples with apples comparisons. The last point I would make is, we need to, and maybe this is a segue to the next agenda item, but we need to be aware that we're in a global competition to attract projects here. Canada, I think, has been a remarkably strong P3 market for a decade. And when I look at it, the reason we've been a strong market, for good and for bad, is because we've had a lot of certainty in process. People could complain about some of the detail of that certainty, but relative to the US, relative to certainly the UK and Europe, we've procured projects quite quickly and efficiently. They close quickly after a selection, and the rules are well known. People may like or dislike the rules, but nobody can say, we didn't understand the rules. And I think we're in huge danger in these new models of entry into a race to the bottom with the UK, Europe, the US, which we will lose if we lose the fundamental advantage that we as Canada have, which is greater transparency and greater certainty than those other markets. The last thing I'd say is, there's a sense in Canada that finance won't take risks. So when Mark Liedemann says, let's get the contractor in earlier, I'm in kind of complete agreement with that. Let's have the contractor do more of the work until you get to a fixed price contract, which can then be, a lower price. But I would replace the word contractor with developer. When I was at CIB, we made a very large commitment to the REM project that was developer-led by the equity investor who took a lot of that risk. And the models which I'm more attracted to are unsolicited proposal models. So in Alberta, we've published an unsolicited proposal approach, early developer-led models, and models supported by CIB financing, which is still financing. It's not funding, it's not free, but it can take risk profiles that are some of the challenges we're all having in the more complex projects today.
Thank you, Nick. If we look ahead in 1, 2 to 5 years from now, what's the forecast? Or what do you anticipate in terms of use of new project delivery models? Michael, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, hugely ambitious pipeline of work, right? In the province of Ontario, 66 billion worth of projects. And as per the market update that we put out last week, I hope that the market continues to see the steady progress of stuff that used to be in the planning phase into the pre-procurement phase and so on and so on. The one place where I would emphatically agree with Nick is that we want to try to give the maximum amount of transparency and predictability to our market. It's why we've moved to quarterly updates of our pipeline and why we've gone further, in fact, to begin to specify for staging purposes when PDC and TA contracts are going to go out. We do need to crack the nut that Nick has pointed at. If we're going to use these models beyond DBF and DBFM, even on an adapted basis, we want to give maximum lead time to our counterparties and to ourselves to be able to articulate what that's going to look like. The specific answer to your question, Pascale, is I think, we have the transit agenda, which is significant in the province of Ontario. The balance of the work that's going to come to market in connection to the government's subways program is a place where Phil and I are thinking quite carefully in the here and now about the sorts of models that would ultimately be used in connection to that. And notwithstanding Mark's commentary, I think we have a clutch of hospital projects in the province of Ontario that are massive in their own right, from Trillium's Mississauga site to the Ottawa Civic and beyond, where, again, these are multi-phased projects that sit face-to-face with large transit projects, be it Hurontario or Confed, and that are effectively reshaping entire precincts of these cities. They are buildings projects that back into some of the same risk characteristics as linear projects, just dint of their size, if you follow me, right? And then, as Mark rightly points out, there's a clutch of smaller projects where their remoteness is the interesting thing. Building a new hospital in Moosonee on the shores of James Bay is very interesting to think about what the right model looks like to ultimately bring that project to market. So hopefully that'll give you some of a sense of where we're thinking about possibly applying new delivery models. But I just want to round back to the principle that Nick articulated and lean into it. I think he's exactly right when he says that what we have collectively, it's not just the contracting authority, it's every bit as much the industry associations, entities like CCPPP and our industry partners. We have created a predictable environment here in the province of Ontario, and that has a very resonant value, and we need to be very careful with it. So I trust that we will continue to have these sorts of conversations on as transparent a basis as we can about which project might get delivered via what model. I think you're on mute, Pascale.
Sorry about that. Mark, is there anything you'd like to add on that question?
Yeah, similar to Michael, I think each project needs to get looked on its own merits. Like, what's the risk profile? What are we trying to achieve? Where we're trying to achieve it is actually very important. We are doing a lot of rural projects, and doing a P3 in a super rural community is not normally very attractive to the market. And then also kind of what's market capacity and what are the competing projects, whether that be at the federal, municipal, or in the next province over potentially, and the private sector. That can also influence our choice of model at that particular time. So there's no predetermined outcome for any project in any location. It really is context specific each time.
Nick, would you like to add anything before we go to the question segment? Oh, and Don also.
Yeah, so look, I'm nervous. I'm nervous as a taxpayer. I'm nervous as a saver because I'm sort of trying to build my nest egg so that I can retire comfortably. And I'm nervous as a P3 practitioner. And the reason I'm nervous is I think if we're not careful, the next decade could be, or the next 5 years, maybe it's a decade, could be characterized by, firstly, government money crowding out private sector money. When I was at CIB, I thought I had it made. I had 35 billion to invest until I realized that my 35 billion, which was, still required a return on investment, albeit a low one, was competing with about 190 billion of completely free grant funding from the other parts of the federal government. So I'm very afraid that the next decade, not only in Canada, but in the US, in Europe, the US particularly, government money is going to crowd out private money. Risk transfer is going to go out the window, and we're going to have some horrifying, cost overruns and Boston Big Dig examples. And finally, I'm, as a P3 practitioner, I'm going to be sitting on the sideline, shaking my head in disbelief and saying, how could we go so wrong? And by the time we have the inevitable readjustments and we learn from our mistakes, I'll be too old to do anything because I'll be well into my dotage by then. So that's my big fear for the next decade, that we just, we get it horribly wrong because we throw out, because of the political environment, because of the economic environment, because money is practically free right now from governments, that we just throw out everything we've learned, we've learned with difficulty through lots of projects over the last 15 years. I'm afraid we throw it all out with the bathwater if we're not careful.
I'm not quite as pessimistic as Nick. Not sure how you could be. I do think, though, that we are moving to competition, and Mark, I don't know that it's just province over. I think it's globally. I think we're seeing the numbers of skilled trades and, more importantly, skilled supervisory personnel and consultants reducing dramatically. And I think that's going to be a huge problem in the next 5 to 10 years. And I do think that contractors are going to be focused on more owner-retained risk, which was one of the things Nick alluded to. We're seeing, as you mentioned earlier, Mark, significant escalations. We're in an unprecedented area of uncertainty, which I think is only being exacerbated by COVID, but the coming out from COVID is going to create a massive amount of global uncertainty in the construction marketplace. And so I think you're going to see owners, if they're going, it's moving from a buyer's to a seller's market. And we're going to see contractors have their pick of projects, and the owners having to do what we did in the 2000s and go back to sort of more appealing project profiles so that contractors play in the market. Because if you don't, and if you get too complicated, they're just going to look to the next project, which is a go in, dig it, get paid, and move along. So I do think owners are going to have to be responsive to that, but I'm a bit nervous that moving to too many adaptive models is actually contrary to that goal.
Thank you, Doug. I'm looking at the hours where we have about 10 minutes left to take on and answer some question. The first one is from Kent and Betts. Like us to speak with respect to the risk share regimes to address input price volatility. So it might be a question for Michael or Mark.
Oh, boy. A question that feels very different to answer today than it did about 6 months ago, I would say. Look, I mean, part of it in the present moment, and we're spending a lot of time, and I'm sure Mark is as well as others. We're talking to political decision makers in the here and now about the quality of cost estimation that we do, the pre-tender estimates that we ultimately produce, and what contingencies are ultimately being carried in respect of those cost estimates, and the difference between a Class D and a Class C and why it's meaningful, right? So let me just begin by owning the portion of it, which I think is on government side, which is to try to be as sophisticated as we can be about understanding as these projects get initiated, what a reasonable, thinkable estimate of the cost of the projects ultimately is. But then to the point, it's an excellent example in many ways of a kind of risk, which ultimately under certain circumstances, perhaps like the ones we're living through right now, in the commercial construct as between ourselves and a counterparty, we'd say, yeah, gosh, that's something where a funded contingency acceptable by both parties with incentivization to ultimately manage its effective usage is what we ultimately want to do. I think that this is akin to what Nick has been talking about the types of things that are possible within our existing models that can, in a very additive way and quite a ring-fenced way, take specific aim at some of these things that might otherwise lead to disputes. It doesn't obviate in any way the fact that we've got to be able, as parties working together, to agree a process associated with accessing those kinds of dedicated contingencies, but that's very much how I think about it ultimately.
The next question is for Nick, and it is as follows. Hasn't the Canadian P3 model been flexible enough to allow bidders to use a higher fraction of equity, but they have collectively chosen not to?
So equity costs money, and the P3 process is fundamentally a competitive process. So if the process encourages you to use as little equity as you can get away with using, that's what you've got to do to be competitive. Almost every equity investor who's touched the Canadian market would like to write a bigger equity check. There's no market capacity issue. They just can't afford to, because the way the project is set up, it discourages anything other than the absolute bare minimum of equity. And, as I say, to use the example, there've been many projects, but one specifically, the private equity was 2% of the enterprise value. We're just deluding ourselves if we think there's any risk transfer. Now, I used to work, as most of you know, I used to work for Macquarie. We were a kind of, a pioneer in the space. We were, for want of a better word, Macquarie was one of the canaries in the coal mine. We exited the Canadian P3 market pretty early on because it became so commoditized. That's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing if expense is driven out for the taxpayer. But, every time Canada then started looking at a much more complex project that needed more equity, Macquarie would prick up its ears and say, okay, this is the project we can come back to Canada for because they need us. This one's difficult, complex, it has lots of risk, it needs more equity. But the Canadian model drove out finance, whether it was necessary or unnecessary. We became a very commoditized model, and almost everything we did drove out private finance. So yeah, anybody who wanted to write a bigger equity check would have been doing so at the risk of competitiveness, fundamentally.
Thank you, Nick. There's a pretty interesting question. It is for Mark to answer. Why has Infrastructure BC chosen the Cowichan Hospital project as its first alliancing project?
Well, I think part of that is kind of a market capacity issue. We have an incredible amount of acute care hospitals being built simultaneously in BC. It's not in my control, but that's the situation I face. So we're struggling to get enough bidders to bid on these projects and build them. There are different types of contractors that are attracted to an alliance type model. Interestingly, in this case, SNC Lavalin is actually one of the bidders on the project. SNC Lavalin will not pursue any work on a design build basis, but they're very much in favor of kind of an alliance type model for themselves globally. So this kind of fits with their board mandate. Now, I didn't do this to satisfy SNC's board mandate, but it is indicative that different models will attract different types of people from the construction market. And at this point, with market capacity strained, and we've already, in our view, sucked a lot of the capacity out of Alberta, to be honest. We see lots of bidding teams that are Alberta-based working in BC. We need everything we can do to make more capacity in the market. And that includes different models. Another secondary component is relating to the community benefits agreement, which is in play here for the Cowichan District Hospital. We've used it successfully on several projects on transportation. This is kind of its first move into the vertical infrastructure space with kind of a different set of contractors. And it's new, and things that are new are kind of unknown for the contractors, and it becomes a higher risk item for them. So to get them more comfortable with the community benefit agreement for the vertical infrastructure space, for the first project, we're proceeding more with this kind of risk sharing basis, which is the hallmark of the Alliance. And we're excited to be using it on that project. But I think,
thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pascale.
Doug, we also have a question for you. Could you explain the principle of no fault, no claims under the alliance model? And is there any exception or qualifiers to that principle?
It's one of the challenges with some of these models is there's a generic term that gets applied to a whole bunch of different contracts that aren't all the same. But if you have a real no blame, no claim, it means that within the project teams, You can't sue anybody. Nobody can claim against each other. If there's a cost overrun, that's just part of the process. There are sometimes an exception for designers, because the only type of insurance that will apply to problems of things like cost overruns is error and omissions insurance for architects and engineers. So in some of the templates, you have a pretty tortured, you can't blame anybody except if you can have access to the E&O cover. So there are potentially some exceptions, and then there may be other exceptions like fraud and things like that. But for the most part, it's intended to be all-encompassing.
Like hockey without the hitting.
That is an excellent analogy, which I do play every Friday night. So.
Don't tell us you played the no-hitting version, Doug.
There are unintentional hits.
Maybe one last question. Are there any plans to develop and deliver a detailed training program for contracting authorities and stakeholders on the new models?
Well, maybe I can take that one, Pascale. Look, 3 things that we are doing. The first of which is focusing on our own internal capabilities and what they need to be in order to, as we've talked about through the course of this session, be as sophisticated as we can be in assuming and exercising the responsibilities that accrue to us through any of these models. That's number 1. Number 2, we've been very fortunate to be given a lot of time by people in the center of government here in the province of Ontario who understand some of the trends and forces that they're hearing about out in the market to, I hesitate to use the word educate, but inform and try to draw distinctions as between the underlying objectives that you solve for in connection to these models. I think that that's critically important. And I think we benefit inordinately from the fact that we are very lucky in this jurisdiction to have really a velocity of conversation with our industry, the half-life of which is measured in days, right? Ultimately in connection to the things that we're intending to do. So again, whether it's platforms like this one or just the conversations we have through commercially confidential meetings in connection to projects, or the things that we try to do speculatively when we are going out to think about the reconstitution of our Schedule 27 DRP, I would just offer my thanks. I think that more than anything, the conversation and the transparency in respect of intent and response is the thing that will stand us in good stead. On top of that, I'm sure that there will be no small amount of cottage industry about educating everybody in Canada about how to think about the participation of these models, but I don't think any of that's a surrogate for our continued conversation.
Maybe one other last question. Sorry about that. There's a pretty good one from the audience. How would you avoid the occurrence or appearance of corruption when using the design development with a sole builder? So I don't know who wants to take on that question.
Well, I'll get started on the progressive design builds where we do get down to one fairly quickly. The alliance is much more of a competitive nature, so there's not really a sole bidder focus there. But on the progressive design builds, I think what we do need is we need a degree of transparency that we don't ask for or require in a competitive design build scenario. So when we are getting a price from the one design build bidder, they will have a series of subcontractor pricing that they've achieved before they can submit that price. So normally in a competitive DB, we don't care about that. We just ask for their price. But here in these progressive DBs, we need a lot more information about kind of which projects, which subcontracts they've tendered, and get some of that subcontractor pricing. Because if you have $1 billion project, the design builder is not and gives you a $1 billion price, a whole bunch of that is subcontracted. They're taking risk on some of that because they're not going to know who the drywall finisher is 3 years in advance or 4 years in advance. But they have lots of information. So it's about sharing, getting the contractors to share that information in confidence, obviously, and then to understand which prices haven't been locked down. And then the public sector needs to take a view with its advisors. Is that reasonable? And is there kind of a reasonable risk premium in there for the design builder to take that risk of the remaining subcontracts and their own services? So it's not perfect, but we need more transparency than we have in a typical design build model.
Maybe if I could just comment quickly. I mean, as somebody who's led, major bidding groups as equity, and at least in theory, have the right to get full transparency, it's just remarkably difficult to get accurate detail. And my experience, and this applies mainly to heavy civil projects, only about 50% of the the cost is a unit cost. So for 50% of your costs, you can say, okay, we're pouring a cubic meter of concrete. A cubic meter of concrete costs X, therefore that's our cost. That accounts for about 50% of a typical cost estimate. The other 50% is risk, contingencies, escalation, and that's very, it's easy to tell looking back with the benefit of hindsight, but it's really difficult to lock down at the beginning. So there are, I appreciate your sentiment, Mark, but I think you've got some heavy challenges ahead of you.
Yeah, I will just point in response, it is quite different in the civil versus the vertical side. Civil, you're gonna have a lot more self-performing. And on the typical hospital project, the general contractor is gonna subcontract 90 to 95%. So it is a different profile. It would be a different challenge under a road or a bridge project, I take that. And we haven't ventured into that to date, potentially for some of those reasons, Nick, so.
So with this, I believe this closes our session of this afternoon. I'd like to thank all of the panel members for your time, your remarks, and your generosity with the comments. Very interesting discussion. I'm sure we'll still discuss it over the last few years with the developments of those new project delivery models. So thank you very much. Thank you to the Canadian Council Public-Private Partnership for having organized this event. Pretty much appreciated.